The air in the Appalachian foothills of East Tennessee clung to everything, a perpetual damp breath that promised rain but only delivered a thin, chilling mist. It was September 1892, and private investigator Thomas Asher felt the mountain's oppressive silence as a physical weight. The train ride had ended hours ago, replaced by a grueling, bone-rattling carriage journey that had finally deposited him in Black Creek, a logging community that seemed less a town and more a cluster of defiant shacks huddled against the ancient, unforgiving slopes of the Smoky Mountains. Thomas, a man built for the gaslight sophistication of a city, felt acutely out of place. His tailored wool suit, already bearing the grime of travel, felt like a costume in this world of rough-spun denim and weathered faces. He adjusted the brim of his fedora, a useless gesture against the pervasive fog that had earned the mountains their name, and looked at the single hand-painted sign leaning against the general store. Black Creek. He was here for a simple matter, or so the telegram had claimed. Elias Thorne, a respected timber baron from Knoxville who had come to the region to survey new tracts of virgin forest, had vanished. Thorne's partner, a nervous man named Silas, who had remained back in the city, had dispatched Thomas with a hefty retainer and vague instructions to find him quietly. Silas feared a business rival, a botched negotiation, or perhaps a simple accident in the rugged terrain. Thomas, however, felt the sticky premonition that always preceded a complicated case, a feeling that whispered this was something far darker than a mishap. The general store, also the post office and the unofficial town hall, was his first stop. Inside, the smell of coal smoke, unwashed wool, and cheap tobacco was overwhelming. The store's owner, a burly man named Jedediah, with a face like carved oak, regarded Thomas with the wary suspicion mountain folk reserved for outsiders. "Looking for Elias Thorne, are ye?" Jedediah's voice was a low, gravelly rumble. He didn't ask Thomas's business. He simply stated his knowledge. News, Thomas knew, traveled faster than any carriage in these isolated valleys. "I am. Thomas Asher, private investigator. Mr. Thorne's partner in Knoxville sent me. I understand he hasn't been seen in 3 weeks." Jedediah spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. 3 weeks exactly. Rode out on his bay mare toward the Josephine property. Told everyone he was inspecting the boundary lines. Never came back. The mare showed up 2 days later, riderless but clean, like she'd been led home. Thomas noted the detail. Riderless but clean. No blood, no sign of a struggle, no broken saddle, not an accident then. The Josephine property? Who are the Josephines? Jedediah's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unreadable. Fear, perhaps, or profound unease. The Josephines. They keep to themselves, deep in the holler where the fog never quite lifts. Old man Josiah Josephine, his wife, and the triplets. The triplets? Aye. The Josephine triplets. Phoebe, Delilah, and Esther. All 28 years old, and identical as 3 drops of rain. Born the same day, look the same, dress the same. Folks here? They say the devil put too much evil in a single soul, so he split it 3 ways. Thomas dismissed the folk superstition with a practiced mental shrug, but the unsettling imagery remained. 3 identical women isolated in a perpetual fog. It was a detail too potent for fiction, yet too real for comfort. And Thorne was headed their way? Thomas pressed. Said he had a meeting. Something about an old property line dispute, though Josiah Josephine hasn't left that cabin in 10 years. Keeps to the woods, he does. Thomas thanked the man and stepped back outside. The fog had thickened, reducing the rough-hewn buildings to gray, indistinct shapes. He rented a sturdy, if aged, horse from the livery and purchased a map, its lines crudely drawn, but seemingly accurate. The trail to the Josephine cabin was marked by a faint, branching line that disappeared into a region labeled simply the Deep Woods. The journey was slow, the silence broken only by the muffled clop of the horse's hooves on the damp earth and the incessant drip of condensation from the pine needles above. The mountain felt like a labyrinth designed to swallow sound and light. Thomas began to see the signs of logging, freshly cut stumps, the scent of sap, until the trail suddenly became older, less maintained. The air grew colder, and the fog closed in so thick that the trees became vertical ghosts in the gloom. After what felt like an eternity, he saw it, a log cabin, blackened by age and damp, surrounded by a fence of rough-cut rails. It was isolated, perched at the edge of a deep ravine, overlooking nothing but a sheer drop and a sea of white mist. There was no smoke from the chimney, no light in the window. The place was unnervingly still. He dismounted, the soft ground muffling his footsteps. He knocked on the heavy wooden door, once, then again, harder. The sound was flat, dead, swallowed instantly by the fog. Finally, a noise, the slow, deliberate scraping of a chair being pushed back from a floor. The door cracked open, just enough for a sliver of light to escape. And then he saw them. 3 faces, pale as porcelain in the gloom, framed by identical long, dark hair, stood shoulder to shoulder in the narrow opening. Their eyes were wide, dark, and utterly devoid of expression, fixed on him with a disturbing, synchronized intensity. 28 years old, the product of a harsh, secluded life, and impossibly, unnervingly the same. "We been expectin' ye, Mr. Asher," one of them said, her voice a low, perfect echo of the others. There was no question, no surprise in the statement, just a chilling, shared certainty. The air around them grew instantly colder. Thomas felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. This was not a simple disappearance. This was a place where human silence spoke volumes, and the mountains hid crimes deeper than any valley. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to appear calm, and stepped closer to the cabin door, the fog swirling at his heels like a living thing. "My name is Thomas Asher. I'm looking for Elias Thorne." The 3 identical women simply stared at him, their eyes like dark pools reflecting the dying light. The door did not open further. The mystery had found its threshold. If you're captivated by the growing suspense and the unsettling mystery of the Smoky Mountains, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next to Thomas Asher and the sinister Josephine Triplets. The investigation is just beginning, and the fog is getting thicker. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken communication between the 3 identical figures. Thomas realized he couldn't discern which one had spoken, or if they had somehow spoken in unison. The lack of individual identity was itself a weapon, a form of psychological intimidation. "Expected me how?" Thomas asked, keeping his voice level, projecting the weary authority of a city man used to questioning the recalcitrant. The middle woman, or was she the left one, shifted slightly. "Pap said a city man would come. When folks disappear, there's always a man in a fine suit looking for answers he won't like." "We heard the horse," another added, her voice a dry whisper that seemed to come from the shadows just behind them. Thomas pressed on, refusing to be drawn into their unnerving rhythm. "Mr. Thorne was last seen heading toward your property to discuss a boundary line. Was he here?" The sliver of a smile, sharp and fleeting, touched all 3 sets of lips simultaneously. It was a chilling synchronization, not of movement but of intent. "Lots of folks ride through our holler," the 3rd triplet stated. "We don't keep track of every stranger looking for timber he doesn't own yet." "I need to speak to Mr. Josiah Josephine," Thomas insisted, subtly pushing his weight against the door. He caught a glimpse of the cabin's interior, dark, Spartan, dominated by a massive stone hearth and the overwhelming scent of pine resin, and something else, something vaguely metallic and earthy. The triplets parted slowly, deliberately, revealing the man inside. Josiah Josephine was seated in an old rocking chair beside the hearth, covered by a heavy wool blanket despite the indoor warmth. He was a brittle, frail man with eyes that seemed too large for his sunken face, reflecting a deep, abiding fear. "Come in, Mr. Asher," the old man rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across a wooden floor. "But mind the threshold. Our cabin's small, and the walls listen. Thomas stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that felt absolute. The triplets immediately positioned themselves against the door, silent and watchful. The fourth member of the household, Mrs. Josephine, sat knitting by a small, dusty window, her head bowed. She did not look up, her needles clicking out a frantic, mechanical rhythm. Thomas approached Josiah. "Mr. Thorne vanished near here, sir. I understand he was looking to settle an old boundary dispute with you. Did he come here?" Josiah coughed, a wet rattling sound. "Thorne, a greedy man. Wants my land. Wants to cut down the oldest woods in the valley. Said he had an old deed from before the war that gave him rights to the ridge line. Did he present this deed to you?" He showed me a copy. "Said he'd be back in a few days with the original to finalize the acquisition. He had a paper with him, a map of the new line. Looked like a city map, all crisp and white." Josiah's hands trembled, clutching the blanket. "And when was this, sir?" "3 weeks ago, day before the horse came back." Thomas paused. If Thorne had the deed, it meant the land was likely his, a fact Josiah seemed desperate to avoid. But if Thorne disappeared before the transaction was finalized, the deed would likely be with him or back in his Knoxville office. Silas had confirmed the deed was missing from the office vault. "Did he leave anything with you? A satchel, notes, perhaps the map?" Josiah shook his head, his wide eyes darting toward the triplets by the door. "Nothing. He drank a cup of water from our well and left. Said he'd spend the night at the edge of the woods and come back the next day. But he never did." The triplets remained motionless, their eyes following Thomas's every movement. He turned to them. "Did any of you see Mr. Thorne leave, or perhaps encounter him on the trail the following day?" The women spoke in shifts, a chilling, conversational roundelay. "Phoebe and I were gathering berries," said one. "We saw his tracks leading away." "Leading toward the ridge," corrected another. "But we saw nothing of the man himself. Only the mare. 2 days later," finished the third, "drinking from the creek without her master." Thomas noticed something small and almost imperceptible on the stone floor near the hearth, a faint, dark stain that had been scrubbed at but not entirely removed. It was close to where Josiah sat. The earthy smell he'd noticed seemed stronger here. "Mrs. Josephine," Thomas addressed the silent woman by the window, "did you see Mr. Thorne?" The woman's knitting stopped. Her hands, gnarled and raw, gripped the needles tightly. She didn't lift her head, but her voice was sudden and sharp, cutting through the heavy air. "He came for the land. The land is ours. He never should have come here. Strangers bring trouble." It wasn't a denial of seeing him. It was a judgment. Thomas knew he wouldn't get a direct answer here. He needed to find the original deed and the land map Thorne carried, the only proof of a struggle or a motive that wasn't solely tied to the sinister family dynamic. Thomas thanked Josiah and his family for their time. As he walked toward the door, one of the triplets, the one closest to the latch, moved her hand to his saddlebag, which he had leaned against the wall. It was a momentary subtle gesture, but Thomas caught it. He stepped past her, picking up the bag and swinging it onto his shoulder. "I will be returning to Black Creek for the night. I'll be back tomorrow to search the property. I assume you have no objection to a search?" Josiah's frail voice piped up from the chair. "Our land is vast, Mr. Asher. The deep woods don't give up secrets easy. You'll find nothing." The triplets merely opened the door. The fog rushed in, cold and damp. As Thomas stepped out, he felt the 3 pairs of eyes burning into his back, watching his every step until the mist finally claimed him. The fear on Josiah's face, the metallic scent, and the chilling synchronicity of the triplets were now the only clues he carried away. He knew now the danger wasn't the mountain, but what the mountain was hiding. Back in Black Creek, Thomas secured a room above Jedediah's store, the only lodging available. The small room was Spartan, smelling of old pine and mildew, but it offered a small comfort, a lock on the door. He laid out the rudimentary map he had purchased and the few possessions he had brought. The case was already far more complex than a simple search and rescue. He spent the evening cross-referencing his notes. Thorne had been looking for a specific tract, a ridge known locally as Widow's Peak, which overlooked the most valuable, uncut timber. His disappearance immediately after confronting Josiah about the deed pointed squarely at the Josephine family. But the sheer ease of it, no body, no struggle, just a returning horse, suggested a methodical, cold-blooded efficiency. The three sisters, that was the crucial unsettling element. Their synchronized responses, their identical features, and the immediate shared knowledge of his arrival suggested a psychological unit, not three separate individuals. He had a theory, one he needed to test. Were they acting as three separate people who simply looked alike, or was there a deeper, more dangerous codependency at play? The next morning, Thomas rode back toward the Josephine holler, but this time he deviated. He found the old, overgrown wagon path that led to Widow's Peak, the land Thorne had claimed. The air was noticeably clearer here. The sun, weak as it was, managed to penetrate the canopy. This was the place Thorne wanted, and it was the place Thomas needed to search first for the missing deed. He tethered his horse and began to hike. The climb was steep and arduous, the ground soft and slippery from the constant mountain moisture. After nearly an hour, he reached a small flat clearing near the ridge. He immediately noticed small disturbances in the earth, not animal prints, but the shallow indentations of a boot heel, likely Thorne's city footwear, and the distinctive, slightly smaller print of a handmade mountain boot, possibly Josiah's or one of the triplets. He got down on his knees, examining the soil. The tracks weren't conclusive, but they confirmed an altercation had taken place here, or at least a tense meeting. Thorne had stood his ground. The other person or persons had moved around him. The metallic, earthy scent from the cabin seemed to linger in the air here, too, masked by the strong smell of pine and damp earth. He scanned the immediate area. A small fire pit, cold and long unused, sat to one side. Near a cluster of moss-covered boulders, he found his first concrete clue, a brass, heavily engraved compass. It was a high-quality piece, clearly not local. It lay on the ground, smashed, the glass cover shattered, and the needle bent. Thomas carefully retrieved it. This was Thorne's. Why would a man surveying a property destroy his own compass? He wouldn't. The destruction suggested a moment of acute panic or frustration, perhaps a fight, or a deliberate act of spite. He was interrupted by the sound of a distant, faint echo. It sounded like a sharp, rhythmic tapping, like metal striking wood, coming from lower down the ridge near the Josephine cabin. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost musical, yet unsettling in its uniformity. He tucked the broken compass away and followed the sound, moving silently through the thick underbrush. He eventually reached a point where he could observe the Josephine property without being seen. The scene was unsettling. The three triplets were engaged in a mundane chore, chopping wood for the winter. But the way they did it was chilling. They stood side by side, each with an identical axe. They swung the axes not in sequence, but in perfect, terrifying synchronicity. The blades rose and fell together, cleaving the logs with three separate but perfectly unified, percussive thuds. There was no conversation, no wasted energy, just the shared, rhythmic labor, a demonstration of their profound, terrifying coordination. This was his proof. They weren't just sisters. They operated with a single, shared purpose, an efficiency that bordered on the monstrous. They were a single, highly effective unit of will and action. As he watched, one of them stopped, her head tilted up, not quite toward his position, but toward the ridge. The other two stopped instantly, their axes suspended in the air, their heads then tilted in the exact same direction. They had felt his gaze. They hadn't seen him, hadn't heard him. The wind was blowing the wrong way, but they knew he was there. The triplet who had stopped first, the one closest to the woodpile, walked over to the cabin wall and retrieved a large, well-used whetstone. The other two followed, mirroring her movements exactly. They began to sharpen their axes, the harsh hissing of steel on stone, replacing the rhythmic thud of the chopping. Again the movement was perfectly synchronized, 3 blades honed into razor-sharp efficiency, a clear, silent message sent directly into the woods. Thomas retreated instantly. He had overstayed his observation. He had found his clue, the broken compass, and confirmed his theory of their unnerving coordination. He was dealing not with 3 suspects, but with a singular, complex threat. He returned to the clearing, his heart hammering not from exertion, but from the raw psychological fear the triplets inspired. He had to find that deed. If Thorne had it with him, the Josephines wouldn't have left it on the ridge. They would have searched for it, and then hidden it, where a city man wouldn't think to look, inside the cabin, or perhaps in a place connected to their daily routines. As he mounted his horse, he looked back at the woods. The fog had begun to creep back up the valley, erasing his trail. He had to assume they would be up here shortly, searching the area he had just left. The game of cat and mouse had begun. The sisters knew he was looking, and now they were waiting to see what he had found and where he would look next. The missing deed was the key, and the triplets were the lock. Thomas spent the next day in the rough Black Creek saloon, which served as the community's de facto information exchange. He pretended to nurse a glass of whiskey. Strictly for show, he needed a clear head, while he listened to the gossip, hoping to find a flaw in the Josephines' monolithic facade. He spoke to a couple of trappers and a railman, subtly guiding the conversation toward the family. The consensus was the same. The Josephines were odd. Isolated, respected for their solitude, but feared for their unsettling similarity. They always been that way, a trapper named Silas told him, pulling on a pipe. Since they were knee-high, never argued, never disagreed. You talk to one, you talk to all of them, like they only got one tongue. Thomas focused on the missing Maderero, Thorne. Thorne was trying to buy their land, wasn't he? Aye, but land up there in the holler, it ain't just property, it's their history. Josiah wouldn't sell. He's a stubborn old mountain man. But Thorne, he was pushy. Came through here boasting about the original deed he had from before the war, proving their claim was flawed. The detail about the deed kept resurfacing. Thorne had been confident he would take the land. He must have brought the document to solidify his threat. The key moment remained the same. Thorne arrived, spoke to Josiah, drank water, and left, only for his horse to return riderless. Thomas kept returning to the water. Josiah had said Thorne drank a cup of water from their well. The following morning, Thomas returned to the cabin. The fog was a little thinner, revealing a damp, gray landscape. He left his horse further down the trail and approached on foot, moving with the practiced stealth of a hunter. He found the well 20 yards behind the cabin, covered by a rough wooden lid. The air around it felt strangely heavy, the humidity clinging to his coat. He lifted the lid and lowered a bucket. He pulled it up, the water clear and cold. He hesitated, then took a small, careful sip. The water was clean, but there was a subtle, almost indiscernible aftertaste. It wasn't the metallic tang of iron that was common in the mountains. This was different, sharp and faintly astringent, almost like an old medicine or a strong, unfamiliar spice. It was similar to the scent he had smelled in the cabin, a scent he now tentatively identified as being linked to a certain type of primitive preservative or cleaning agent. As he knelt by the well, examining the bucket, he heard a sound, not the synchronized movement of the triplets, but a slow, heavy drag from the cabin. He flattened himself behind a cluster of rhododendrons, a plant with thick, leathery leaves that offered good cover. The back door opened, and Mrs. Josephine emerged. She still hadn't looked at him directly, but she knew he was there. She carried a large, empty galvanized tub, the kind used for laundry. She walked with a stiff, arthritic gait to the well, her head still bowed. She stopped by the well and looked down into the water, her eyes finally lifting, not toward Thomas, but fixed on her own reflection in the water's surface. Her expression was one of profound, exhausted sorrow. She lowered the tub, filled it, and turned to walk back. But she paused, her eyes drifting to the ground near the well, right where Thomas had knelt. She saw the minute disturbance in the mud, the faint impression of a city boot heel. She didn't react outwardly, but her whole body tensed. She knew. She turned her gaze toward the rhododendrons, not looking at Thomas, but through the exact space where he was hidden. Her lips parted, and she spoke, her voice a low, painful moan, not directed at him, but at the mountain itself. Go home, man. There's nothing left here to find but sorrow. Some deeds are buried deeper than any grave. It was a warning and a confession wrapped in one. Thomas waited until she was back inside, the door latch clanking shut. He realized the old woman wasn't complicit with the triplets' actions out of malice, but out of a desperate, perhaps victimized loyalty to her family or terrifying fear of her own daughters. The comment about the buried deeds was too specific to ignore. He returned to the well, pulling up more water. He poured a little into his palm and rubbed it between his fingers. The metallic astringent scent was still there, subtle but persistent. He remembered his research. Certain types of strong lye or crude homemade disinfectants could have that lingering, sharp scent. They were used extensively in the 19th century for preserving and cleaning, or for obscuring. The well was the common point. It was where Thorne had drunk, and it was the source of the faint, unpleasant aftertaste. Had the water been poisoned? That seemed too crude, too visible. If he was dealing with the three synchronized minds, their method would be more subtle. He scanned the immediate area again, focusing on the ground between the well and the cabin. Near a stack of split logs, the same logs the triplets had been chopping, he noticed a small pile of ashes that looked recently disturbed despite the damp. He knelt and sifted through the remnants. He found it, a small, partially burned piece of heavy treated paper. It was singed black at the edges, but a portion of the ornate script remained visible. The script was an old, stylized American legal font, declaring in part, "By the authority of the state of Tennessee." It was a fragment of the missing deed. They had burned it, but why? If they had killed Thorne for the land, why destroy the evidence that the land was his? The destruction of the deed meant they didn't just want the land. They wanted the history erased. They wanted no record of Thorne's claim or his visit. The deed and Thorne were linked. The deed was a target because it proved Thorne was there for a purpose, and destroying it made his disappearance seem like a simple flight or a woodland accident. Thomas straightened up, the fragment clutched in his hand. The true psychological terror was dawning. The triplets weren't just protecting their land. They were maintaining a perfect, chilling, silent order. And the old woman had tried to warn him. He had to find the body, the ultimate proof of the crime, before the triplets realized he had found the ashes. He was no longer just searching for a man. He was challenging a shared pathological will. The discovery of the deed fragment confirmed Thomas's worst suspicions. Elias Thorne had been murdered, and his visit was systematically erased. The only remaining physical evidence was the body, which, given the Josephines' methodical approach, would be deeply hidden. Thomas knew he couldn't simply search the vast acreage of the deep woods. He had to leverage the psychological component of the family. He decided to split the unit, exploit the old man's evident fear and the mother's desperate warning. He returned to the cabin in the early afternoon, riding his horse right up to the porch, a clear show of intent. This time, only one of the triplets answered the door. She stood alone, perhaps Phoebe or Delilah or Esther. It was impossible to tell. She held an iron skillet in one hand, suggesting she was in the middle of preparing a meal. "You're back, Mr. Asher," she said, her voice flat. "Did you find your deed?" "I found a piece of it," Thomas replied, his gaze unwavering. He didn't produce the fragment, letting the verbal claim hang in the air. "I believe you burned it, along with Mr. Thorne's map." The woman's expression did not change. "We burn a lot of paper in the winter. Keeps us warm." "Mr. Thorne is dead. You know it. I know it. And I suspect your mother and father know it too. I'm here to find out what happened and where the body is, not to judge. The dead are the mountain's business, not yours. It becomes mine when it's murder, Thomas countered. I need to speak to Josiah, without you or your sisters present. The triplet hesitated, a microsecond delay that was the first sign of a crack in their shared defense. This demand was outside their routine, a direct challenge to their control. "Pap is restin'," she finally said. "Then I will wait." Thomas dismounted and walked past her, deliberately stepping over the threshold into the dark main room. The room was as he remembered it, dark, the scent of pine and lye heavy in the air. Josiah was in his rocker, but Mrs. Josephine was gone. The old man looked utterly defeated, his wide eyes full of water and terror. Thomas pulled a chair close to Josiah and sat down, lowering his voice to a low, persuasive drone. "Josiah, listen to me. Your daughters are protecting you, or they believe they are. But they have murdered a man, and the law will find them. There is a way to mitigate this, but it requires the truth. I know Thorne was killed here. I know they burned the deed." Josiah's body shook under the blanket, but he remained silent, glancing nervously at the triplet, who still stood by the door, skillet in hand. "The three of them," Thomas continued, leaning in, "they are too much alike, aren't they? It's not natural, that perfect agreement. They are a single, terrifying force. They don't think like people. They think like a shared unit. But you know who they are, Josiah. You named them. Phoebe, Delilah, Esther. Which one of them is the leader? Which one holds the key to the whole terrible secret?" Josiah clamped his mouth shut, his thin lips pressed into a tight, desperate line. He then looked down at the floor right where Thomas had noticed the dark stain before. Thomas followed the gaze. The stain, now almost invisible, was close to the hearth. He remembered the metallic, earthy smell. He looked toward the hearth itself, a massive, crudely built stone structure. "The hearth, Josiah," Thomas whispered. "Did Thorne struggle here? Was this the place?" Josiah began to rock, faster and faster, a sound of frantic distress. He finally managed to choke out a single, barely audible word, his voice racked with fear. "Basement." The triplet by the door moved instantly, dropping the skillet with a loud clatter that shattered the suspenseful quiet. The sound brought two more rhythmic footsteps from an inner room, the other two sisters. They emerged, their faces identical masks of sudden, cold fury. "Pap," one of them hissed, moving quickly toward Josiah. But Thomas was faster. He stood up, putting himself between the triplet and the old man, his hand resting conspicuously on the concealed holster under his jacket. "Stay back. Your father is speaking to me." The triplet nearest the door ignored him. She rushed to Josiah, pushing Thomas aside with a surprising surge of strength, and gripped her father's face between her raw, calloused hands. "You tell him nothing, Pap. You hear? Nothing." Josiah was weeping now, a silent, helpless shaking. Thomas knew he had pushed too hard, too fast. The man was too terrified of his own daughters to confess. "The basement," Thomas repeated, his voice booming in the small, dark room, drowning out the old man's cries. "The metallic scent. It's lye, isn't it? Used to scrub the floor, used to preserve or to neutralize a stench. Thorne's body is in the basement." The three sisters stood perfectly still, their combined gaze freezing Thomas in place. Their identical faces were now etched with a chilling, shared resignation, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. One of them spoke, her voice deadly calm. "We tried to warn you, Mr. Asher. The mountains swallow what they don't want." The threat was palpable. Thomas realized he was trapped in a small, windowless cabin surrounded by three women who operated with the efficiency of a single, highly motivated killer, and he had just uncovered their deepest secret. He needed to get out, find the basement entrance, and return with a warrant. "Where is the entrance to the basement?" Thomas demanded, slowly backing toward the door. The triplets did not answer, but they began to move, spreading out in a silent, perfectly orchestrated maneuver, cutting off his path. The final confrontation was only a matter of moments away. He had the secret, but they had the home advantage and the advantage of being three. Thomas knew he was operating on borrowed time. The triplets, now alerted to his knowledge of the basement, would not let him leave. The sheer power of their synchronized movement made any attempt to charge the door suicidal. He needed a distraction. He spotted a cast-iron poker leaning against the stone hearth. With a sudden burst of speed, he lunged for it, grasping the heavy rod. The triplets reacted with instantaneous, fluid grace, their individual movements blurring into a single defensive arc. "Stay back!" Thomas shouted, swinging the poker in a wide, desperate arc. The closest triplet ducked, the metal whistling inches above her head. The resulting commotion was exactly what he needed. Mrs. Josephine, startled by the clatter and the shouting, finally lifted her head from her knitting. Seeing her daughters cornering the city man, her face contorted in a silent scream of terror. She didn't move to help Thomas, but her sudden, visible panic served its purpose. Thomas pressed the attack toward the fireplace, forcing the triplets to converge. "The truth is downstairs. You can't hide it forever." He feigned a strike at the nearest sister, then pivoted violently, slamming the butt of the poker against the stones of the hearth. The heavy impact reverberated through the small cabin. The triplets momentarily shielded their faces, a natural, collective flinch. That split second was all Thomas needed. He sprinted toward the door, ignoring the anguished cries of Josiah, whose fear had now reached a fever pitch. He flung the latch and burst out into the foggy afternoon. He didn't make for his horse. The triplets would anticipate that. He ran straight for the back of the cabin, toward the well, expecting a root cellar or a hatch. There was nothing. The cabin was built on the lip of the ravine, sitting on solid, unforgiving rock. He scanned the immediate perimeter, desperately searching for any deviation, any man-made feature. He remembered the metallic, earthy scent, stronger near the hearth. Josiah had used the word basement. He returned to the side of the cabin, the heavy breathing of the triplets already audible from the front door. They were coming for him, silently and quickly. Near the corner of the cabin, almost entirely obscured by a tangle of tough mountain vines, he found it. Not an external hatch, but a small, heavy wooden door, set low into the foundation stones. It was secured by a thick, rusted iron padlock. Thomas dropped the poker and frantically examined the lock. It was old, but sturdy, requiring a specific key. The triplets rounded the corner, their three figures emerging from the fog like a single, unstoppable apparition. They carried no weapons, but their intent was weapon enough. "You break that lock, Mr. Asher, and you break the only piece this family has left," one of them warned, her voice unnaturally calm. Thomas ignored her, pulling his own lock-picking tools from a small pocket in his inner coat. They were delicate, useless against this kind of brute iron. He needed the key, or a hammer. He looked at the three advancing sisters. Their formation was deliberate, a slow closing semicircle. They weren't rushing, they were enjoying his desperation, letting the psychological weight of their inevitable capture crush him. "One of you has the key," Thomas stated, fighting to keep his own voice steady. "Give it to me and I walk away. I send the authorities and you confess. It's the only way to save yourselves." The triplet on the left raised her hand and pointed a single accusatory finger at him. "You came here to steal our secrets, just like Thorne came to steal our land. We deal with thieves the same way." He knew they were moments from seizing him. He threw the useless lockpicks into the vines and looked desperately back at the small iron-plated door. The key was a dead end. Then his mind flashed back to Josiah's face, racked with fear, looking down at the hearth. The hearth, where the stain was. The hearth, where he had found the first fragment of the deed. The hearth was a key location, not just a room feature. Thomas executed a sharp turn and ran back towards the front of the cabin, the triplets now in full pursuit. He burst through the door and straight for the fireplace. Josiah was still shaking in his chair. Mrs. Josephine was now by the window, her face buried in her apron, weeping silently. Thomas gripped the sides of the hearth, ignoring the searing heat of the stone. He felt along the rough, dry mortar. The hearth was the source of the metallic scent, the place where the lye had been used most heavily. It was also the closest structural feature to the basement. His fingers found it, a slight gap in the mortar near the stone floor. He pressed on the stone, but it didn't budge. He then jammed the handle of the iron poker into the gap and applied maximum leverage. With a grinding screech of stone on stone, a large section of the hearth's side panel swung inward, revealing a set of dark, uneven wooden steps leading down into a profound, suffocating darkness. The air that rushed out was cold, stagnant, and carried an undeniable, pungent odor of decaying organic matter and a sickly, sweet chemical masking agent. The lye. Thomas looked up. The triplets were standing in the doorway, their three faces a portrait of pure, cold defeat. Their secret was exposed. "You found it," one of them murmured, the voice stripped of its prior menace, replaced by a hollow finality. "The key wasn't metal," Thomas said, panting, standing over the open hatch. "It was knowledge, the truth about what you did and where you did it." He didn't descend. Not yet. He had confirmation of the location. Now he needed a witness, and he needed the law. He had to escape the cabin again, and this time the triplets would be prepared. He stepped back from the hole, poker in hand, realizing the true danger was not in finding the body, but in escaping with the knowledge. The stench from the open basement hatch was sickening, an undeniable confirmation of death and a crude attempt to cover it up. Thomas's victory in locating the body was instantly overshadowed by the grim realization of his peril. He was still trapped, and the triplets, having lost the element of surprise, were now moving with a desperate, lethal intent. The three sisters separated, their movements perfectly coordinated. The one on the left moved to block the main door, the one on the right circled toward the kitchen area, and the middle one advanced slowly toward Thomas, her eyes locked on his. They were establishing a killing zone, and he was squarely in the middle of it. "Don't go down there, Mr. Asher," the closest one warned. "What you find won't bring him back, but it will bury you." "But the law will bury you," Thomas retorted, keeping the iron poker ready. He didn't want a fight. He wanted a clear path to his horse. The sister near the kitchen suddenly produced a long, heavy butcher knife, the blade reflecting the dim cabin light. The other two, one at the door and the one closest to him, simply shifted their stance, their hands ready. The initial facade of passive mountain women had vanished, replaced by three calculating assassins. Thomas looked down at the open hatch. Descent was a gamble. It would take him out of their line of sight, but it would trap him in a dark, confined space with an unknown layout. Escape was equally perilous, as the sister at the door was now positioned to cut off that route entirely. He needed to break their unity, their terrifying synchronization. "Phoebe," he said sharply, addressing the one nearest the door, choosing the name at random, "your sisters did this to protect you, didn't they? They knew Thorn was coming for the land, and they knew you were the one who wanted it most." The woman at the door flinched, a slight, almost imperceptible hesitation in her posture. It was the break he was looking for. The other two reacted instantly. The one with the knife hissed, "Silence, outsider! You know nothing of us." The third sister moved to cover the momentary lapse, closing the gap in their perimeter. Thomas pressed the advantage, addressing the knife wielder. "And you, Delilah, you're the practical one. You supplied the lye. You made sure the water was safe to drink for the family, but tainted enough to cover the initial scent of the act." "He lies!" the one at the door shouted, her composure cracking completely. But Thomas was watching the third sister, the one closest to him, the one who hadn't spoken, who hadn't been directly accused. Her eyes, which had been unblinking, now had a flicker of something new, a cold, internal calculation. Thomas pointed the poker directly at her. "No, the real leader, the one with the true cold heart. You are Esther. You planned it. You engineered this perfect crime, manipulating your father with fear and your sisters with a false sense of loyalty. You're the one who convinced them that 3 bodies of evidence were better than 1. Esther, if it was Esther, did not flinch. She simply smiled, a thin, chilling curve of the lips, a private acknowledgment of a truth he had only guessed at. "You are clever, Mr. Asher," she said, her voice a low, single note of pure malice. "But clemency is not a mountain custom." She lunged, not for Thomas, but toward the fireplace mantel, and snatched a small, heavy object, a decorative brass container. As the other two sisters advanced, Thomas realized his mistake. He had separated them only to put them in their most lethal positions. He sidestepped the charging sister and leapt straight into the open hatch, disappearing into the darkness just as the first sister's hand grazed his coat. He hit the damp dirt floor of the basement hard, the cold seeping instantly into his bones. The air was thick and foul, the floor uneven. He scrambled to his feet, pulling a match from his pocket and striking it against the stone wall. The sputtering yellow light revealed a small, dirt-floored root cellar, piled high with canned vegetables, potatoes, and sacks of grain. But in the center, partially covered by a few ragged burlap sacks, was the reason for the stench. A shallow grave, barely concealed, the disturbed earth settling with a terrible finality. As his eyes adjusted, he saw the final chilling detail. The basement wasn't just a storage room, it was the entire foundation. And nestled into the stone foundation wall, just below the surface of the packed dirt, was a small, empty, rectangular depression. He heard the heavy footsteps above him, and a shadow fell across the open hatch. "We knew you'd look for the body, but we knew you wouldn't look for all of it." Esther's voice drifted down, calm and terrifying. He shielded the match. "What are you talking about?" Thorne was a big man, Mr. Asher, and he knew too much. We couldn't risk him talking, even in death. The three sisters now stood at the lip of the hatch, casting three identical, elongated shadows down the stairs. The sister at the front held the brass container. "We had to make sure the deed was truly buried," another sister added. With a heavy thud, the first sister dropped a solid, rectangular block of dressed stone into the open grave. It fit perfectly into the rectangular depression Thomas had just noticed. It was a gravestone, unengraved, designed to be completely flush with the dirt floor. The third sister then pitched the contents of the brass container down the hole. It was a sickly sweet, thick fluid, the lye, undiluted. Thomas understood the final horrifying trick. Thorne's body was in the grave, and the slab of stone was the true final lock, a foundation stone they could replace with ease, covering the grave completely and restoring the structural integrity of the cabin floor. The lye would do the rest, obscuring the evidence of the body just as it had masked the crime scene. They hadn't killed him just to stop him from taking the land. They had engineered his total and permanent erasure. He had the truth, but he was cornered, deep beneath the earth, facing three people who had planned not just a murder, but a vanishing act. You've just witnessed Thomas discover the horrifying truth beneath the Josephine cabin. The mystery is solving, but the danger is at its peak. If you're on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss the escape, the confrontation, and the ultimate twist in the final 3 chapters. The sudden horrifying realization of the triplets' meticulous planning, the shallow grave, the stone slab, the lie, lent a chilling clarity to Thomas's mind. He was trapped below ground with the physical evidence of the murder, while the killers held the only exit. "You've buried your secret under your own home," Thomas stated, his voice tight. "But I've seen the grave and I know your names. It changes nothing. It changes everything." Esther's voice resonated from above. "The stone is back. The scent will fade. The mountain will keep its peace. You, Mr. Asher, are now part of that peace." The sisters began to descend the wooden steps. They moved with slow, deliberate confidence, using their bodies to block the dim light from the hatch, plunging the basement into near-total darkness. Thomas was on his own, with only the heavy iron poker for defense. He smashed the poker down onto the stone floor, the sudden, deafening clang echoing through the confined space. It was a desperate gambit to buy time. The triplets flinched, momentarily halting their descent. Thomas knew the key to his survival lay in exploiting their three-in-one identity. They were powerful as a unit, but individual, unexpected attacks might briefly paralyze their shared will. He quickly scanned the cellar, his eyes now semi-adjusted to the gloom. He spotted a stack of old, dry firewood near the foundation wall. He darted toward it, grabbing a handful of kindling, and then, with a savage yell, hurled it up the stairs at the advancing figures. The sudden, chaotic spray of dry wood briefly broke their rhythm. The sister in the lead stumbled, grabbing her face. The other two paused, one reflexively helping her sister, the other searching the dark for Thomas's outline. The synchronization was disrupted. Thomas didn't wait. He charged the stairs, not intending to climb, but to attack. He swung the poker up blindly, hitting the legs of the second sister with a sickening thwack of metal on bone. She cried out, a single sharp sound that was the first true expression of pain he had heard from them, and tumbled backward, taking the third sister down with her in a tangle of limbs and skirts. He scrambled up the stairs, throwing the heavy poker down at the struggling mass below, effectively barricading the narrow stairwell. He burst out into the main room, gasping for the clean, albeit pine-scented air. He looked over at Josiah and Mrs. Josephine. The old man was weeping hysterically, and the mother was staring, wide-eyed at the commotion, her knitting fallen to the floor. Neither moved to help or hinder. They were spectators to their own family's collapse. Thomas ran for the main door, but the sister he had struck with the kindling was already up, clutching her shoulder, her face contorted in a mask of rage. She moved to cut him off. He feigned a dash for the door, then spun toward the window. He kicked out with all his strength, shattering the dusty glass in a deafening crash. The sound was a violation of the mountain's quiet, a clear signal that the private affairs of the Josephine family were now public. He vaulted through the splintered frame, tearing his coat and skin on the jagged glass shards, and hit the ground running. He didn't look back, but he heard the door slam open behind him and the 3 pairs of footsteps hitting the dirt. He ran for his horse, which was tethered out of sight just beyond the rise. The fog had begun to roll back in, a thin, deceptive blanket that masked the familiar trail. He reached the horse, fumbling with the reins, his hands slick with sweat and blood from the glass cuts. Just as he threw himself into the saddle, he saw them. The triplets stood side by side on the crest of the hill, their clothes dusty and torn, their dark hair disheveled, but their eyes burning with undiminished cold purpose. The closest one, the one he had identified as Esther, reached down and picked up a heavy piece of split firewood. She hurled it with surprising speed and accuracy. It struck the horse's flank with a loud crack. The horse shrieked and bolted, tearing down the overgrown trail in a blind, panicked gallop. Thomas clung to the saddle, fighting to regain control. He was thrown against the mountain foliage, taking painful lashes across the face and chest. He didn't look back until he was a good distance away, until the sound of the sisters' pursuit had faded into the mountain silence. He slowed the horse to a walk, his body aching, his mind reeling. He had escaped, but at a price. He had no gun. It was still in his saddlebag, too dangerous to retrieve during the fight. He had lost his poker, and he had exposed himself as a direct, physical threat. More importantly, he had left the body and the stone slab behind. The physical proof was once again sealed away. His only remaining asset was the knowledge, the names, the location of the grave, the lie, and the crucial fragment of the burned deed, which was still safely tucked inside his coat pocket. He had the why and the how, but he needed the proof that would stand up in a court of law against the testimony of 3 seemingly innocent, identical women. He reached the relative safety of the main wagon track. He turned his horse toward Black Creek. He had to ride hard and fast before the triplets could follow, before they could organize a more lethal pursuit. He was a city man, alone in their mountain, and he had just uncovered a murder they were prepared to kill again to protect. The horror was no longer psychological. It was a matter of survival. Thomas arrived back in Black Creek well after dark, bruised, bleeding, and utterly exhausted. He stumbled into Jedediah's general store, his clothes torn and stained with dirt. Jedediah, who was preparing to close up, took one look at the disheveled city man and knew instantly that the mountain had fought back. "What in the blazes happened, Asher?" the store owner demanded, grabbing a lantern. Thomas, leaning heavily against the counter, simply whispered, "They killed him, Jedediah. Elias Thorne is dead. His body is in the basement of the Josephine cabin under the hearth. They sealed it with a stone slab and lye." Jedediah's rough face went pale. He locked the front door and moved Thomas to the small, dusty back room. He produced a bottle of corn whiskey and a clean rag, and without a word began cleaning the cuts on Thomas's face. "Murder in the holler," Jedediah muttered, shaking his head. "I always felt a coldness in those three, but not this." "I need help, Jedediah," Thomas said, accepting a burning swig of the whiskey. "I need a posse or the local sheriff. I need to go back there with the authority of the law and expose what they've done." Jedediah sighed, a deep, weary sound. "The local sheriff, Amos, he's a good man, but he won't ride against the Josephines without proof you can carry. He's kin to half the county, and he respects the mountain code. They'll deny it, all three of them, and they'll have their parents backing their story of a mad outsider who broke into their home. The proof is there. The body is there," Thomas insisted, his voice rising in frustration. "Aye, but the entrance is hidden, and the stone is set. You burst into their home, attacked them, and escaped. To a jury, you're the aggressor, the trespasser. You need a key that unlocks more than just the basement door, Asher. You need a way to break them." Thomas pulled the charred fragment of the deed from his pocket. "This is a piece of the deed Thorne was carrying. They burned it. It proves their intent to hide his claim and his visit." Jedediah examined the fragment closely under the lamp's light. "It's a start, but it's still just a piece of burnt paper against three identical faces. You need a witness who isn't you. Mrs. Josephine," Thomas realized. "She tried to warn me. She knows the truth, and she is terrified of her daughters. She is the weak link, the one who hasn't fully committed to the murder." "Maybe," Jedediah agreed, "but she's a Josephine, and blood is thicker than lye in these mountains. You go back, and they'll be ready. They'll have a rope waiting for you, and a grave deeper than Thorne's." Thomas spent the night planning, staring at the map, analyzing his failure. He hadn't broken their unity, only momentarily disrupted it. His direct accusations had only solidified their defensive stance. He had to approach this like a chess game, anticipating not one move, but three coordinated moves. The following morning, Thomas decided on a daring, unorthodox plan. He knew he couldn't take on the three of them physically. He had to use the one weapon they couldn't control, their parents' guilt and the mountain sense of justice. He bought a sturdy rope, a pickaxe, and a shovel from Jedediah, paying in gold. "You're going back, aren't you?" Jedediah asked, his voice low and concerned. "I am. But I'm not going back for a fight. I'm going back for a confession." Thomas met the store owner's gaze. "I need you to ride to the sheriff. Don't tell him the whole story. Just tell him that the city investigator, Thomas Asher, has found evidence of a serious crime at the Josephine property, and that if he rides out by midnight, he will find the perpetrators, or a body, or both." Jedediah hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'll ride, but you be careful, Asher. Those triplets, they're too evil for history books. They'll try to write you out of theirs." Thomas left Black Creek before dawn, riding slowly, cautiously, taking an unused deer path. He needed to arrive undetected. He reached the cabin around noon. The sun was out for once, burning off the fog, but the cabin retained its oppressive shadow. There was no sign of movement. The splintered window frame was crudely boarded up. They were preparing for a siege. Thomas dismounted, leaving his horse tied far back in the woods. He approached the cabin on foot, carrying the shovel and the pickaxe. He walked straight to the front door and knocked, a calm, deliberate rap that belied the terror he felt. The door opened immediately. The three sisters stood there, identical, clean, and unnervingly calm, as if the violence of the day before had never occurred. They were dressed in fresh, identical homespun dresses. They looked like a picture of rustic innocence. "We knew you'd return, Mr. Asher," Esther said, her voice smooth. "We've been expecting you." "I'm not here to fight," Thomas stated, holding up his empty hands, the tools resting on the ground behind him. "I'm here to offer you a way out, a way to save your parents." The triplets merely stared at him, their shared expression one of cold, calculating doubt. The final confrontation, a purely psychological battle, had begun. The stillness of the three women was more unnerving than any threat. Thomas stood on the porch, his back to the tools, forcing a calmness he didn't feel. "Your father is sick and your mother is terrified," Thomas began, his voice low and firm. "They know what you did. You can cover up the grave with stone and lie, but you can't cover up their guilt. I'm offering you a choice. Confess the truth. Tell me which one of you is the leader, and take the blame, and I will intercede for your parents." Esther, the leader, the planner, he was certain, took a half step forward. "There is no leader, Mr. Asher. There is only us, and there is no guilt. The man came for what was ours. The mountain swallowed him." "The mountain didn't swallow him. You made the mountain your accomplice," Thomas shot back. He decided to play his final card, one that addressed their shared identity. "When you were born, the doctor who attended your mother said a chilling thing to your father, something he has never forgotten, that three souls sharing one face was an unholy imbalance. He told Josiah he should have abandoned two of you to the wilderness to find balance. And every day since, your father has been paralyzed by the knowledge that he created a monster with three heads. He chose to let the monster live, and now the monster has killed for him." The effect was instantaneous. All three faces fractured, the perfect mask of unity shattered by a single powerful wave of mutual distress. Their eyes darted toward one another, and for the first time, Thomas saw fear, not for themselves, but for the exposure of their deepest shared trauma. "He lies!" one of them yelled, her voice breaking. "He doesn't!" Thomas pressed, watching Josiah through the open door, his face a canvas of pure agony. "Your father's fear of the three of you is what you've used to control him. He confessed to me that Thorne's body was in the basement. He told me the location, and I have a fragment of the deed you burned. The law will see the parents of the killers as accomplices." He moved past the sisters and walked toward Josiah, who was now rocking uncontrollably. Mrs. Josephine was openly sobbing. "Josiah," Thomas said gently, placing a hand on the old man's shoulder, "the sheriff is coming. Tell me the truth. Which one is Esther? Which one did the killing?" The three sisters closed ranks behind Thomas, a wall of silent, murderous intent. They knew the sheriff was coming, and they knew they had to silence the old man first. Josiah looked up at Thomas, his eyes swimming. He opened his mouth, but before a sound could emerge, one of the triplets stepped forward, placing a hand over his mouth. "Do not speak, Pap," she whispered, her voice gentle, yet absolute. The other two sisters turned, their attention suddenly focused not on Thomas, but on the open front door. "The sheriff is here, isn't he, Mr. Asher?" Esther asked, her smile returning, cold and self-satisfied. Thomas heard the distant but unmistakable sound of horses and men coming up the trail. He had bought enough time. "He is," Thomas confirmed, "and he'll find Thorne's body, or he'll find three murderers." Esther stepped away from her sisters, walking toward the stone hearth. She pointed a finger at the floor, right where the hearth entrance to the basement was. "There is no basement, Mr. Asher. There is no stone. There is no body. You have been alone in the mountains under the fog, and you have lost your mind." She turned to her sisters. "Phoebe, Delilah, stand with me. Let us greet the sheriff and tell him the truth about the lying city man who broke into our home and threatened our parents." As the three sisters stood together, their identical forms perfectly aligned, Thomas watched a final chilling act of psychological manipulation. They weren't just denying the crime, they were preparing to use their shared identity, their ultimate defense, to make Thomas's own testimony seem unreliable, delusional. The sheriff, a large, weary man named Amos, entered the cabin with Jedediah flanking him. He stopped dead, looking from the bruised, agitated Thomas to the three perfectly composed, innocent-looking sisters and the weeping parents. "Sheriff Amos," Thomas said, stepping forward, "these three women, Phoebe, Delilah, and Esther Josephine, murdered Elias Thorne 3 weeks ago. His body is buried beneath the hearth in a hidden cellar. They used lye to conceal the evidence." The three sisters looked at Sheriff Amos, their eyes wide and full of distress. "Sir," Phoebe said, her voice clear and sweet, "the man is distraught. He rode up yesterday, broke our window, and attacked us, demanding we tell him where our basement was. There is no basement, sir. We are poor, honest folk." "He threatened our pap," Delilah added, her voice trembling slightly. "He is disturbed," Esther finished, her eyes holding a silent, triumphant challenge for Thomas. "We are simply three sisters, sir. We have never harmed anyone." Sheriff Amos looked at the three identical faces, then at the shattered window, then at Thomas, covered in cuts and wild-eyed. He looked at Josiah, shaking in his chair, and Mrs. Josephine, who refused to look up. He was faced with the perfect, self-sealing lie. Three witnesses in perfect agreement against one frantic outsider. Thomas knew his only chance was the physical evidence he couldn't carry. He looked at the hearth, then at Jedediah. "Jedediah, show him the hidden latch. It's behind the stone panel." Jedediah hesitated, his eyes darting to the sisters, whose gazes were fixed on him. The mountain code of silence and kinship fought with his basic decency. Sheriff Amos finally spoke, his voice heavy with doubt. "Thomas Asher, I will search this property, but if I find nothing, you will be arrested for assault, breaking and entering, and false report. You claim to have the proof. Show it to me." Thomas knew the triplets had reset the stone slab and sealed the hatch with the furniture and their own bodies the moment he fled. He would look like a lunatic, but he had come this far. He pointed to the hearth, and then to the small, empty, rectangular depression in the basement floor, a detail only he and the sisters knew. "Look beneath the hearth. The proof is there. The key isn't a lock. It's the truth of their shared mind, which you must break to find the lie." The sheriff, followed by his deputy and a deeply reluctant Jedediah, moved toward the hearth. Thomas watched, knowing the climax of his investigation depended entirely on whether he could find the tiny seam in the stone that he had risked his life to expose. The triplets watched with serene confidence, their dark eyes reflecting the silent, chilling victory of their unbroken unity. The horror was not in the murder, but in the absolute, terrifying coordination that allowed three to become one, too evil to ever be truly caught.